Okay, I think we can get started. We'll still have a few more folks joining us, but good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Felicia Lucht, and I am the Academic Director of the Language Program Office, and it is my sincere pleasure to welcome you to the 2023 Less Commonly Taught Languages Career Fair with our first panel session, Opportunities in the Private Sector, and we're defining private sector broadly here. And this is for learners and users of less commonly taught languages. This event is organized by the Language Program Office, and underneath that, the Wisconsin Intensive Summer Language Institutes. And it's made possible through the generous support of the Institute for Regional Studies, IRIS National Resource Center. And it's sponsored by UW-Madison Area Studies and National Resource Centers, as well as a number of our great UW-Madison partners and statewide partners. We will be in our fourth year this year, and we're very happy to have this event as it connects speakers of less commonly taught languages with professional development and career opportunities. It'll be a chance for everyone to engage with leaders and experts from governments to the private sector and human services. We'll be sharing personal stories and professional advice about living a multilingual professional life. And just as a quick reminder of our agenda, tomorrow on July 27th at 1:30 p.m. Central Time, we'll have our keynote address with U.S. diplomat Lachlan Soper, followed by the Opportunities in Government for Learners and Users of Less Commonly Taught Languages. On Friday, July 28th at 2 p.m. Central Time, we'll have Opportunities in Human Services for Learners and Users of Less Commonly Taught Languages. So I want to sincerely thank our panelists today, all of our staff and organizers, and our sponsors who are all listed on the lichtelcareers.wis.edu website, which include our Summer Language Institutes, our colleagues and partner units in the International Division, which hosts IRIS and the Area Studies National Resource Center, as well as our other campus partners and collaborators, including Language Institute, Russian Flagship, Cultural and Linguistic Services. So thank you all for being here. Just some brief housekeeping matters before I turn things over to our moderator. Feel free to submit questions using the Microsoft Teams Q&A feature. And as a reminder, if you're having technical issues, you can email us at lichtelcareers@iris.wisc.edu. Cameras and microphones will remain off. And so now it is my great pleasure to introduce our moderator, Amani de Holten, the Intern Abroad Advisor and Program Manager of UW-Madison International Academic Programs. Thank you, Amani.
Thanks, Felicia. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I'm really excited about the conversation we're going to have with our panelists this afternoon. So I'm going to kick it off with a brief introduction of our panelists, and then we will turn to questions for discussion amongst the panelists. And at the end, we're hoping to save a few minutes for audience questions as well. So like Felicia mentioned, feel free to put those in the Q&A. Our moderator, Chris, will be taking a look at those. All right, so in terms of our panelists, we have here today Lydia Greevy, who is a Resource Mobilization and Grant Manager at the World Organization for Animal Health. Lydia is a UW-Madison alum and a SASLI alum and received a Critical Language Scholarship for Hindi and Urdu. Then we have Isabel McCrae, an Impact Project Consultant and Language Specialist. Isabel is a polyglot with working professional proficiency in Azerbaijani, Turkish, Portuguese, and Spanish. Then we've got Charlie Menard. Charlie's a US manager at Marama. Charlie's also a UW-Madison alum and speaks Spanish and Portuguese. And finally, we've got Katie Sinnott, Vice President of Global Trade and Investment at the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation. Katie served as a key expert on the advisory board for the Wisconsin Language Roadmap Initiative that put forth an action plan to expand, promote, and strengthen world language education. So thank you all for being here today. And we'll dive right into it. So, you know, at the heart of it, language is how we build relationships with each other. It's how we share our identities with the world and across borders in both our professional and our personal lives. So I was hoping that to kick it off that the panelists can introduce themselves a little bit more if they'd like and tell us how less commonly taught languages are a part of your life in specific ways or more generally. And Lydia, would you like to get us started?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks very much. Happy to be here today speaking with all of you. My name's Lydia Greevy. I'm currently based in Geneva. As Amani mentioned, I am a UW alumni. I graduated in 2015 with a bachelor's degree in political science and languages and cultures of Asia. While I was at UW, I studied a lot of languages. I studied Turkish and Azeri, French and Hindi and Urdu. I've always been very interested in languages. I was an exchange student in high school to Turkey and took French in high school, and actually chose to study at UW-Madison because of the number of language programs that it offered. After I finished my bachelor's degree, I moved to Geneva for grad school. I have a master's in international affairs. My goal when I left for grad school was to go get my master's and come back and work for the U.S. government. I decided to stay in Europe more for personal reasons, but wanted to stay in the international domain. So I did some internships. I got sort of into the global health sector, after which I decided I wanted to move to Paris, also for personal reasons, and wound up finding a job in an international organization, the World Organization for Animal Health, which is where I am working now as a grant manager and resource mobilization manager. So sort of working with governments and foundations to who want to provide funding to our organization for different projects focused on different animal diseases. So I don't really work in the private sector, but they told me that I could be part of this panel anyways, and I'm happy to be here. I use French in my daily work and in my life, and I use my other less commonly taught languages when I can. I still have a lot of contacts in those regions. So when I'm traveling, when I meet new colleagues or stakeholders, they're always happy to meet someone who speaks their language. So I'll stop my introduction there without being too wordy. And hand it back to Amani. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Lydia. Let's turn to Isabel.
Hi, everyone. I'm really delighted to be here speaking with you all today. So my background, as Amani mentioned, I work in quite a few different languages. The main one I do work in is Turkish, however, and so everyone wants to know about the backstory for that. And it really started even before university. I spent some time volunteering in Turkey, traveled in the Caucasus and Central Asia as well. And when I went to do my undergrad, I actually started in community college, Portland Community College, and was able to really benefit from some amazing federal programs like the Critical Language Scholarship, which I did for Turkish, American Research Institute in Turkey fellowship as well, and then the Gilman, which I did for studying in Azerbaijan, and so I was able to study both Turkish and Azerbaijani at the same time. And that really set me up for having quite an involved relationship with these languages in my career. And I went on, I did some work in international education. I worked with the Turkish flagship program, for example. But then these days, I moved to London to do my master's degree at the London School of Economics, and I decided to stay. So I'm mostly based still in London, but I've kind of gone the direction of consulting, and I work with not-for-profits, think tanks, a lot of them based in Turkey, actually, as well as the UK. I currently work for the Center for Geopolitics at Cambridge University as well. And then I also do work as a language specialist as an interpreter, and that is a range of private and public sector, because I also work for the DOJ as an immigration court interpreter. So that's some of the variety there, and I'll pass it back to Amani.
Thanks, Isabel. All right, Charlie, I'd love to hear from you next.
Cool. Let me know if my audio is not good. I think my image looks a little blurry here. Yeah, so I like I'd mentioned, I graduated from Madison in 2015. At Madison, I studied both accounting and Portuguese, kind of a unique combo. But the way I got into Portuguese, actually, I was starting to study Spanish, and I was going to do the Spanish major. And then as a part of the major, you can take one other romantic language and have it count towards that major. And I took Portuguese, and I just fell in love with it and completely stopped learning Spanish and went all in on Portuguese. And as a result of that, I got the FLAS fellowship, and I was looking, and it seems like you still have that at Madison, which I would encourage students to look into and apply if you haven't, to study Portuguese. And so I studied abroad in Sao Paulo, took a bunch of classes my senior year, and then I was very adamant about living in Brazil after college, and I found a job at an accounting firm in Rio right after college. And so I moved to Rio, and I worked there for about 2 years, 2.5 years, obviously speaking Portuguese on a daily basis. It was an American accounting firm, so they wanted like a CPA background. And then from there, I moved back to Chicago, and I worked at a logistics startup doing Latin American expansion. And so also using my Portuguese, I was in charge of the Brazilian launch. And so I was like the point person. So I was in the Chicago office, but I was speaking Portuguese on a daily basis and taking trips to Brazil constantly. And then 2 years ago, I actually moved to Mexico City to work at an e-commerce startup here. Half the company is in Brazil, and so I use my Portuguese quite frequently here, but obviously I speak Spanish like the majority of the time. And yeah, I mean, and we'll get into this, but Portuguese, like as you can tell, has had a massive impact on my life, and I'm happy to share that with you guys.
Thank you so much, Charlie. And last but not least, Katie.
Thanks, Armani. I'm Katie Sinnott, working for the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation. We're the lead economic development entity for the state of Wisconsin. And my team, the Global Trade and Investment team, helps companies export better and faster, as well as we also attract companies to live and grow in the state of Wisconsin, whether they're international or national companies. I always wanted to live overseas. Wasn't sure. I didn't really think about language, but I have a degree in finance from the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse. And I knew that I wanted to use that skill, but also go overseas. And I had a couple options, and I could have gone to Europe or several other countries or to Hong Kong. And at that time, I thought, well, Hong Kong will be really different. China's just opening up. This was in 1992, so a bit ago, when Chinese was less commonly spoken around the world. And so I thought, well, you know, going to the UK or to France, that's very similar to our own culture. I, of course, learned later that is not at all true, but I wanted to go to China. So I went to China in 1992 and studied Mandarin for 9 months and only just returned to the United States in 2013. This happens a lot in Hong Kong. People go for 6 months, 9 months, and they never come back. And that experience guided my move eventually to Beijing, my joining a great consulting firm in China, opening my own business in China, and so much more, which we'll get into. Thank you.
All right, thank you all. It's so interesting to hear about the wealth of different experiences that we have on this call and how language has shaped all of your lives in different ways. I know several of you mentioned that some ways that your work and your studies have been supported by different grants and scholarships. You know, Charlie mentioned FLOSS, the Foreign Language and Area Studies Fellowship. Isabel mentioned the Critical Language Scholarship. So turning to kind of some practical advice for our audience here, do you have strategies or resources that learners and speakers of less commonly taught languages should know about when they're thinking about internships or employment opportunities or further study? And how do people come into positions that can integrate a less commonly taught language? I'll just throw that out there for any of you that'd like to respond.
I can hop in on the side of scholarships. So I was lucky. I had an incredible career advisor at my university. And through that program, I was able to find a Mandarin language study program through the Yale China Association. They have a Mandarin language program with the Chinese University of Hong Kong, or CUHK. This program was launched in 1977, and it still exists today. It was, for me, an amazing program. I could never have moved to Hong Kong on my own because the cost of living, even in that time period, was very high. And through the Yale Study Abroad program at CUHK, They paid for my tuition, my room and board, my transportation, and even gave me spending money. And it was just an incredibly solid program. It is one of the most highly respected programs in Asia even at this time. So that would be one area where I certainly would look if you were looking for Mandarin, Cantonese, and now they even teach English.
I can I can recommend the Bourne Scholarship. I benefited from that to study abroad my junior year in India. The Bourne Scholarship there's a scholarship for undergrad and there's a fellowship for graduate students, and it's basically a scholarship for students who want to go study abroad, study a less commonly taught language, and you commit to then working for 1 year or 6 months for the U.S. government after you do that scholarship or fellowship. And at the time, I had wanted to work for the U.S. government, so that was a good opportunity for me. And if you're interested in working for the U.S. government, I would definitely recommend checking out that opportunity.
Charlie, I think you had something that you wanted to add.
Yeah, I already mentioned it, but the FLOSS Fellowship, I think, is a super sweet thing that everyone should look into. It's for various languages at Madison. And, Madison's a big school, so you kind of have to take initiative, like to get these things. And so maybe we can send out links to these 3 scholarships or something afterwards. And then in addition to that, I think like in general, looking for jobs, in my experience, LinkedIn is a super powerful tool. And if you can find, especially someone with like something in common, like from your hometown or went to Madison or whatever school, and send a message, people are very receptive to talking, especially to like young career people, and especially people who are like interested in an international career, because it's kind of like a very like-minded group. And so I would encourage LinkedIn as well.
Thanks for that tip, Charlie. I know, this is as a part of the career fair. I think there's probably a lot of folks on the call wondering how to find, a position that can help incorporate the less commonly taught languages that they may be studying. So I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts on kind of finding positions.
Let's see, I guess I can add a couple things. In terms of finding positions, I mean, I think if you are trying to or aiming to work in a quite niche language, those can be hard to find, right? And of course, if you find them, apply for them. But in my personal experience, the strategy of just expanding my network and getting connected to all of the resources that might be available around that community, around that language. If you're in university, that is such a great resource in itself. There might be lecturers visiting that you can meet. There might be different kinds of societies or clubs. And then there are also professional associations. If anyone's interested really in going down the language career path, I am part of the American Translators Association, which is the biggest professional association for anyone who works in languages in the United States, like in North America and maybe beyond. And there are incredible resources there for people who are interested in pursuing a career in specific languages. And that can also be a great way to network and potentially get work in a way in which people come to you versus you going out and cold applying for things.
I think I would add one thing, Amani. Charlie was talking about LinkedIn. I think that's an awesome resource. I also think using LinkedIn or other resources to look for companies that work in the countries where the language you speak is spoken. That's a great way to get connected with those companies because they're looking for people like you. And also reach out to your government officials, people like me or your federal officials who work in trade. They're going to also know those companies and might even be able to facilitate introductions. And lastly, like Lydia mentioned, don't forget your federal resources. The U.S. State Department and the U.S. Commercial Service are always looking for people.
Fantastic. I think that's a great kind of set of starting tips and resources for our attendees to think about. I know that some students that are studying less commonly taught languages might worry or question that their language abilities are not strong enough or that they're not ready to use them professionally. Do you have advice or strategies for conveying your language abilities in different contexts? So things like in a resume, in a cover letter, in an interview. Any thoughts on that?
I think like I'm not sure what this like naming convention is, but like this A1, A2, B1, B2, C1, C2, like listing specifically like and realistically where you are with the language, I think it kind of shows like you're not just putting fluent, you're putting something more specific on your resume. That's one idea.
I can speak a little bit to the like perhaps emotional side of this. I think if you're learning a language as a non-native speaker, there can be a lot of imposter syndrome, I think, and constantly questioning yourself, do I really speak this language? Do I really speak at an adequate level? And if you're getting to the point where you're above intermediate or so, I think if you look for opportunities, whether those are through internships, it could be volunteering, it could be a whole variety of unpaid opportunities, getting yourself into a situation where you are forced to use that language is just so incredibly helpful. And if I speak for myself, my Turkish is at a very high level and I've worked in Turkish for many years, but last year I had the opportunity to get qualified as a court interpreter, and the imposter syndrome that I felt having to learn a whole new terminology of legal language was very intimidating. So I think, but you practice, you get over it, you apply it, and then you move up, and then you can show that to your future employers or anyone else that you are able to employ those languages in a practical manner.
Yeah, I would say that maybe the hardest thing is sort of getting your foot in the door, like getting that first position, hopefully professional position where you're paid to use the language that you speak. And it gets easier from there. But I agree with Isabel. There's a lot of imposter syndrome, or you might be around native speakers or people who have been studying a lot longer than you, so you don't feel as qualified to be there. But you need to recognize that you were hired or selected for that position. You should have confidence in your abilities and know that it does get easier from there. But breaking in is can be difficult. Yeah.
And often the language is a complement to a skill, like Charlie said, he's a CPA. So they're looking for a specific skill set. And then Charlie, having his Portuguese, made him just that little bit more attractive. So, focusing on the stronger skills that you have allow you to build the other skill.
Yeah, I was going to say that. I think it's good to like parlay the language with one other like more hard skill or more, I guess, specific, like industry specific skill is a useful approach.
This is actually a perfect segue to the thing that I wanted to ask you all about next, which is the fact, we've been talking about speaking proficiency, which is obviously like very important when you're thinking about learning additional languages, but language learning can also help you develop soft skills. And if any of you have thoughts about kind of transferable soft skills that learning languages can help you develop, that speakers or users of a less commonly taught language might, be thinking about in employment, skills that employers might be interested in hearing about, other than just like, I can speak X language at X level.
I think that having fluency in another language, it allows you to understand that culture. We talk about that a lot, that you integrate into that culture. And so that will help you, for example, in doing a business deal. If you are working in that country, you're going to understand that culture's perception of how they would do a negotiation. So I think that would be one thing, that you understand the culture more. But I also think that knowing one language, for example, I have Chinese and French, but that doesn't mean that I don't then understand or am more empathetic to speakers from other countries. So when I'm in Japan, the culture is a little bit different, but I'm already attuned to different cultural nuances. So I think people who have fluency in another language bring this empathy and understanding to the table, which I think is incredible for any company. I also think just learning a language is tough. And it really shows perseverance and dedication and patience, which is a great skill that all employers will be looking for.
Yeah, I would echo that, Katie. I think that empathy, the cultural sensitivity is an incredibly valuable soft skill that all employers should really care about, especially if you're working in some kind of people-facing positions, to be able to say, yes, like I can be in different cultural contexts and feel comfortable. I can work with staff who are from different cultural backgrounds. I can work with people who are non-native English speakers and being considerate of where their speaking levels are at, for instance. And those are all really valuable things that you can try to convey in an interview or a cover letter.
I know, and I'm going to interject a personal story here, but from the students that I work with that intern abroad, as an undergrad and maybe get to use those language skills a little bit during their internships, one thing we talk a lot about is problem solving, right? If you don't have the vocabulary that you need to be working in a particular situation, how can you talk around it, or how can you figure out a way to communicate what you're needing to communicate? And I mean, that problem solving is a skill that's useful in, I think, just about every job. That's a great one to take with you as well. Any other thoughts here on kind of the skill sets that come along with language learning?
I would agree with what's been said. I think it shows discipline, empathy. Yeah, and as someone who's like learned a language, I think they appreciate it even more, like the work that goes into it.
Very, very true. All right, in terms of professional development, when we're thinking about developing professionally and trying to incorporate language and incorporate kind of cross-cultural experience, that comes with challenges and potentially even tensions. It can take a lot of work. Do you have any insights about how to kind of prioritize your professional growth and reach for those professional opportunities while you're also kind of focusing on maintaining or strengthening your language abilities and your global competence? This can sometimes be, potentially competing goals.
I think one of the most important things about, professional growth, you should have a target of what you want to do, but to incorporate your language into that professional growth, I find that living in a country where that language is spoken is really the primary thing to do. I don't think I would have had the advantages that I had without moving to Asia to a place where that language was spoken all the time. That way you can frequently find many different jobs that would fit your requirements and still be using that language. I have found that to be true since I haven't had any job without an international component since '92. And, be selective about ensuring that you have that international component.
I would say to be a bit creative about how you market the different experiences that you've had. When I was in grad school, I spent a summer working as a resident director for the NISLI program, the National Security Language Initiative for Youth. So I took a group of high schoolers to India. I was their chaperone for the summer and helped them learn Hindi. That wasn't totally aligned with my professional goal at the time, but I wanted to get back to India. I wanted to, again, use my Hindi skills. And in the end, it was valuable for my professional development. I think it was a position where I had a lot more responsibility than I would have had if I interned at whatever UN agency that summer. So I think if you're creative about how you explain the different experiences you've had using your languages, employers can be interested to hear that.
That's so interesting, Lydia, because I had a very similar experience of after I finished my undergrad. I worked for CLS as a resident director in Azerbaijan, and Again, at the same time, my background is much more in political science, and I was really interested in doing social research and field work in that area. But because I had the language skills, I had these jobs open to me that they were in international education. They were really good and interesting jobs, even though they weren't necessarily aligned with the direction I ultimately wanted to go. But they allowed me to support myself and be in country and get that experience working in country. And I do think that's incredibly valuable if you have the possibility to get out of the US and have a chance to, even if it's just an internship or an actual paid position, like that is so valuable for employers, whether they are in the US ultimately and you come back, or they're, in the place that you choose to relocate to.
I know we talked earlier about the power of networking, whether that's connecting on LinkedIn or, using your circles at your campus or here in the US to kind of just get connected and start that networking process. Do any of you have an example of like successful networking that you've done that has provided you or maybe a colleague an opportunity to use your multilingualism in a professional setting?
I can go. Just a quick story. Like the way that I found my first job in Brazil is actually kind of funny. When I was in college, I was doing like an online exchange with a Brazilian girl. I was helping her with English and she was helping me with Portuguese. And she told me that she was doing the same exchange with an American guy who was working at Goldman Sachs in Sao Paulo. And I was like, whoa, that's what I want to do when I graduate. I want to like work in a finance field when I graduate in Brazil somewhere. And so she introduced me to him, and nothing, like, it wasn't like an immediate like job offer right away, but after I think like a year or two, he introduced me to my future employer, who ended up hiring me. And so just like a kind of serendipitous, but also like I put myself in the right place to like get that type of referral or meet that type of person. And so that was eye-opening for me. That was one of my first like moments of networking where I was like, whoa, this is useful.
Yeah, what a great story, Charlie. Thank you for sharing that.
I have one too, which definitely goes along with my general advice for everyone here today who's thinking about going into languages. I think I was just finishing up my master's at LSE, and this fantastic Turkish journalist and writer, Ece Temelkaran, gave a lecture, just a free public lecture, and I had followed her work. And so I showed up to the lecture by myself, and the woman sitting next to me ended up being really lovely, and we became friends. And she, during the pandemic, she ended up referring me to a Turkish education company that had their headquarters in London that she had done a little bit of work with. And then I ended up having a very great relationship working with that company for the past 3 years, actually. And so it was just, I just happened to put myself out there, do something that was related to my interest in the culture. And it is a long game, but you never know where it's going to take you.
I would add, I mean, I'm not sure if all the students go to Wisconsin or different universities, but whatever university you go to, I think using and like meeting like the professors like on a deeper level and the various people in the languages department, and I think there's a lot. Yeah, that was something that was very helpful for me. It ended up like helping me get the FLAS fellowship and thinking through like what jobs are even possible for like a 22-year-old who wants to move abroad.
Right. I think networking is key. It's so funny that for the job I have now, I accidentally met someone while networking, and they invited me to a Chinese restaurant to see if I really could speak Chinese. And once they figured out that I could, then my resume was put forth for this role, which I thought was pretty interesting. Just checking,
Yeah, a little pop quiz for you. I know when I speak with students about networking, sometimes it can be built up into this really scary thing of I have to, go give my business card, which I may not even have, to someone and, give them an elevator pitch about what kind of role I'm looking for. And I think it can be so much simpler than that, right? It can be introducing yourself to someone you sit next to at an event, like Isabel said, or just kind of the casual interactions that we have. You start to meet people that are interested in these languages. You start to build just that kind of circle. LinkedIn can make it really easy to stay in touch with them. And then like Charlie was saying, it may pay off, a couple years down the line. It's about those connections that we're building. It doesn't have to be something super scary. All right, so I want to make sure that we have time to get to audience questions, but I did have one more question for all of you, the panelists. We've talked a little bit about, advice that you're giving to the audience, but knowing what you know now, where you are in your current positions, what's one piece of advice you wish you could give yourself at the start of your professional journey?
I guess no one wants to give ourselves advice. I have advice, which is not language advice at all. For me, I did exactly what I wanted to do in my professional journey, really exceeded expectations of my own. But the one thing I would say is if you live overseas and you are from the United States and you think you will never come back to the United States, which I thought because I was outside the US for many, many years. Remember, wherever you live in the world, don't forget that you may one day come home and that maintaining your credit rating is super important. Because I never thought I would come back, and that was an issue when I came back. So just a little note to self about that. And I tell that to everyone now.
That's something I never would have thought of, Katie. Thank you.
That's something to keep in mind. Thanks for that, Katie. I think for myself, when I finished university and when I finished my master's as well, I part of me really thought, okay, I'm just going to get like the perfect job is just going to come to me and like I'll just apply and I'll get a great job because I have a good education and I know all these languages. And it wasn't so easy. I mean, graduating during a pandemic, it wasn't easy generally. But I think what I would have told myself is that my energy would have been much better placed in networking and focusing on relationship building over just applying like a crazy person to all of these positions, only very few of which I would ever hear back from. And for me, in my professional experience, now looking back, I would have told myself to calm down a bit on that and realize that careers, I think there's so many more possibilities for what our careers can look like these days. And there are non-traditional careers out there. There are traditional careers out there. There are so many different opportunities and you can live some at some point and then it can change down the line. And to just be a little bit more relaxed about the ideal career and securing that immediately when you get out of college, because I think the way the economy is and the way things are, like it may not be as a straight shot as it used to be, perhaps. So focusing on your skills, focusing on your network, building your profile, and not stressing out too much. That's what I would have told myself.
Yeah, I think my advice sounds similar to Isabel's. I would say to be open to new experiences because there are a million different professional paths. You might have a good idea, or you probably have a good idea of what you think you want to do, but there might be things you don't know about yet. Your life circumstances could change. So I would say to pursue your goals, but just be willing to explore new options and try new things as you have the chance to try them.
Yeah, I'll end it with like, yeah, very similar. I guess like patience would be the piece of advice. Like I didn't know when I graduated, I studied accounting and I worked in accounting for 2 years, and then I realized I really disliked it and I didn't want to have a full like 40-year career in accounting. And I switched, and then I started in startups and logistics, and I found that much more like suitable to my personality and like the way I think. And so one, I didn't know that people do that, but it was a decision I made, and it was a mentor told me like just switch if you're unhappy with that. And so I guess like patience and being open to, trying new things, I think is, especially in your 20s, like it's a good time to try things.
Absolutely. I mean, how many of us here on the call, panelists, how many of you knew that you'd be in the job that you're in right now when you finished college? None of us, right? Yeah, exactly. There's so many opportunities out there that we're not even aware of. So thanks for all those insights and those pieces of advice. Hopefully they resonate with some of our audience members here. I think now we're going to be able to turn it over to some Q&A from the audience. Chris, do we have any questions that have come in that our panelists can address?
Yes, we actually have several. One of them is asking that what method or mode of learning LCTL did you find most useful for building those professional and niche language skills apart from cultural immersion?
Doing little things, like if your phone could be in that language, change, so you're always interacting. For me, I don't speak Chinese every day anymore, so I try to put my environment in Chinese as much as possible.
This might be a little cliche, but like soap operas, like if you probably watch TV, right? Even if you're watching an English show, put the subtitles in your target language and you'll absorb a little bit of it. But like ideally watch it in your target language and watch it with the subtitles in that language. Don't do any English, but if you're starting out, you can ease into it. And there are so many options for podcasts nowadays too, and I personally love podcasts, and I think it's a way to sort of passively receive the sound of that language if you can't be in country.
I think like I always think you need to have a tutor. Like there's so many cool websites that you can there's like marketplaces online that you can find a tutor in whatever language you're learning, and I'm not I think that the price depends on the exact language you're learning, but I don't know, once every 2 weeks, 3 weeks or something, like have an hour call. I think that's super important to be like active with your language. If it's not something that's spoken in the US, like wherever you are, like you can find something online for sure.
And I guess just anecdotally for myself, I know I love playing video games, and I have actually joined different video game servers where the main language is going to be, predominantly from that area and that region. So you'll see a lot of not only text in that language, but also the actual audio from that language. So if you're a big gamer, I highly recommend that.
Also, like Instagram accounts are great. Just like to jump off that, like Instagram, TikTok, if you follow accounts that are in the language, you can also pick up on different humor, current events. It's definitely like a good way to get some immersion from afar too.
Yeah, the memes. That's the best way to understand the culture.
I'm taking notes here. These are some great ideas.
I have a couple of other questions too. They're definitely still trickling in. If we'd like to try another one, if that feels like a good place to segue. We did discuss a lot about different ways to connect with people using LinkedIn. And one of the questions that we have is, do you have any suggestions on how to be a little bit more maybe tips and tricks or precise in those searches using LinkedIn, and how to help ferret out those connections?
I think there are multiple ways. One, if you've targeted specific companies that are in the country of the language you want to speak, you could seek out people who work for that company. You could reach out to their HR person, for example, and say, I just want to learn more about your company. Can we do an informational interview? Also, there probably are language groups on LinkedIn, people who are speaking specific languages that you could connect with, or looking for the trade folks that work for the government like myself on LinkedIn. They too might be able to connect you in, are some of the ways I would look.
I work with students on this a lot. So one tip that I have is in the search bar, if you put like a keyword that you're looking for, like maybe you're in a particular industry and you're looking for engineering or something. Then when you search that, you can select people, and then there's a lot of options to filter people. And so you can filter them by their current location that's listed on LinkedIn. So you can see everybody that has the word engineering in their profile that's in a particular city or country. You can also filter by what school they have listed that they attended. So if you're like, I want to connect with, alums from my institution that might be living in that country, you can also put that filter in. And that's a really nice way to kind of find some of those more personal connections. So you can be like, hey, I see you went to University of Wisconsin. I also went there. Or I see you're from, your hometown. I'm also from that place, that you can kind of make those personal connections. And that's a really nice way to do some one-on-one intros.
Fantastic, thank you. Another question that we have is, for expats in competition typically with other natives of work, is there any suggestion that you would have to make it maybe easier, or is it kind of a misnomer depending on your language in the country of whether you being, a foreigner going to a different location or vice versa, making the job search any harder or easier?
Lydia, I know you're in Geneva right now. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I have a few thoughts. It's important. I would say it's important to do your research about the like legality of moving to the place you want to go to. You in truth, for me, it's difficult. I mean, you are in competition with people from all over the place. Like if you want to live in the EU, for example, if you want to live in Switzerland, for example, the company needs to prove that there's no one in Switzerland and no one in the EU who can do the role that they would be hiring you to do. I work in international organizations, so their hiring rules are a bit different. But I think in the private sector, and probably Katie or others can say more about this, it is a challenge and something that you should research well to understand like what criteria you need to meet.
Mhm. I think it's more challenging today than it was when I started back in the 90s. Many companies are localizing their teams. They have less expats because that is often more successful because the people know the culture and the language, although people here would have a leg up on that. One strategy that I would take is to perhaps join the company here in the United States and then, work through different levels in the company. If you have a long-term goal to stay with them and hopefully go abroad, you could make that part of your interview process, even saying, I'm really interested in your company long-term. I know that you have operations overseas. I'd love to be part of that, but happy to start here in the US.
Excellent, thank you. Another question we have is, how would you suggest gaining confidence if it's been a while since you've had an OPI or other standardized test, especially since those can so often be contextually in a small moment in time, and how to best prepare for that and not feel, put down when you possibly could take one and they take you down instead of you picking up any more points, so to speak.
I'll take this one because I had to do so many OPIs in my undergrad. And one thing that I always did, and I'll still do if I have a very perhaps complex, interpreting assignment, is like phone a friend. If you have a native speaker friend from, or pen pal or whatever, someone from your travels, maybe someone from studying abroad, or you do one of these one-on-one tutor sessions like through italki, as Charlie was talking about. But doing that right before your OPI can be really great if you just spend an hour, half an hour, even 20 minutes, just talking on the phone with a native speaker, talking in the language, talking about what you ate for lunch and the weather, can be a really big confidence boost. And you'll be in the right mindset that your brain is working in that language. And so then when you pick up the phone to talk to the OPI and they ask you, okay, describe your best friend, you'll be like, oh yeah, no problem, green eyes, brown hair, whatever. So that's one trick that I use all the time, or have used in the past.
Thank you so much. Does anyone have any experience with interpreting or translating? And if that's any suggestions on ways and advice to break into that field of work?
I can jump on this one if none of you guys do. Okay. Yeah, so I started in translation in 2018, and that happened sort of when I was living in Turkey, and was like, oh, it's a native speaker who speaks Turkish. Let's hire her to do some incredibly underpaid translation work. Great. But that's progressed to where I am today. If this person who asked this question wants to talk further, feel free to add me on LinkedIn because I have lots of insight into this. But I'll say for now, there are a lot of great resources. Definitely look at American Translators Association. You can also look at the National Language Service Corps, which is a kind of a voluntary organization of people who work in languages and want to work voluntarily for the US government. That's a great community, and they have tons of resources. But it is definitely a really interesting career. And if you are at a high level in your target language, and it is a very less commonly taught language, you can really establish a niche for yourself. And that can actually be, very commercially viable as a translator or interpreter.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I think just paying attention to the time, we might have enough time for one more quick question. Do any of y'all see any trends for the next few years when it comes to languages, specifically in like particular studies or regions that might be needed that may be a good place to focus on? Which I'm sure we all like to say like our own personal language, but
yeah, I was just gonna give like a shameless plug for Portuguese. Like I think Portuguese is such a like a interesting language to learn. Everyone learns Spanish in the US, or like a lot of people do at least, but very few people learn Portuguese. And the population of Brazil is massive. It's like 220 million or more, with like a very low on average English ability. And so like naturally there's a lot of opportunity and like value there.
I think it's hard to predict like which language will end up being useful. I mean, you could consider like geopolitics and try to predict where the next big issue is going to be and hope that you were studying that language, a few years before, and you're going to be the one who can step in and be useful. But I would say study a language that you're interested in and for whatever reason. I don't know, maybe you have family ties to it, or you've had a neighbor who spoke it when you were a kid. Whatever reason you have to be interested, just go. I would say to go for that. Don't try to predict what's going to be the most marketable in the future, because it might be hard to predict that.
This might be a little off left center, off of, I'm not sure what is that term, but anyways, I think like some of the indigenous languages, we're seeing huge shortages of people who are able to interpret in like indigenous Central American languages in the US. So maybe looking at some immigration trends, for instance, could be a way to look into where there's a need, because there are massive shortages of speakers of certain languages in the US. And even though everyone is qualified to have an interpretation in the healthcare system, in the legal system, so that could be a place to do a little bit of research.
Excellent. Thank you all so much.
All right, so I believe that is kind of the end of our time together here today. I want to thank again our fantastic panelists for sharing their expertise and their knowledge with us, and I think giving us all some tips, some tricks, some advice to take forward with us in the future as we think about incorporating language into careers. So thank you all so much for your time. Thank you to the audience for being here, and of course, to the wonderful folks organizing all of this for us. We will leave it here, and I wish everyone a great rest of their day.
Thank you. Bye.